Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. To the Lord I will sing. I will make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel. These words come from a song that a woman named Deborah sang in the book of Judges. Her story is only 2 chapters long, but it's not just her story. She shares it with a tent-dwelling woman named Jael. In comparison to other narratives of biblical characters, little is given to us about Deborah and Jael. Even so, they have much to teach us about leadership, even from unexpected individuals. Together, they remind us that leaders need focus, allies, and courage. Though short, their story is surprisingly complex. Let's try to understand some context first. After the Exodus from Egypt, Moses led the Israelite people through the wilderness for 40 years. Joshua eventually led them into the Promised Land, but the Israelites had to contend with several nations already there. After the Israelite tribes spread out across the Promised Land, a new era began, the time of the Judges. Before Israel was given a king, judges ruled. The writer of the book of Judges describes this area in Israel's history as a cycle of defeat and victory, based upon the nation's spiritual condition, obedience or disobedience to God's commands. Every time a new judge was raised up to unite them and lead them back to obedience to the law of Moses, they had victory and rest from their enemies. But afterwards, the lure of other gods would lead them astray, and they would be conquered and oppressed. The stories of the judges show the way to guard against the dangers of spiritual decay. Starting in Judges 4, we read that Deborah was a judge and a prophetess. Israel was oppressed at that time by Deborah, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. During this time, people came to Deborah for decisions, and she spoke for the Lord. She told a military commander named Barak that the Lord wanted him to go to Mount Tabor and prepare for battle. Barak refused to go unless Deborah went with him. She agreed, but Barak was dishonored for his hesitation to obey. When the battle began, the text says the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots, all his army, before Barak. As the Bible suggests, the battle essentially was fought between opposing spiritual forces, the God of the Israelites and the gods of the Canaanites. The God of Israel prevailed. Sisera ran to the tent of a woman named Jael for refuge. Jael was a Kenite. The Kenites lived among the Israelites, but they were mostly at peace with the Canaanites. When Sisera asked for water and a safe place, Jael gave him milk and a place to sleep. After he slept, she took a hammer and a tent peg and drove the tent peg into his skull and killed Sisera. The text says that through her, the Lord subdued the Canaanites that had oppressed Israel. The story of Deborah and Jael sounds like a tale of 2 female superheroes. They faced tremendous threat to safety in the face of fierce foes. No matter what dangers we face, we can learn from their courageous examples. First, Deborah and Jael teach us that leaders need focus on the right things and to lead others in that focus. Israel was struggling because they had failed to conquer all the surrounding inhabitants, which led to distraction, temptation, and the fascination with foreign gods. The judges are raised up to refocus the Israelites on their covenant with the one true God. In Deborah's story, we can see her focus in particular ways. For example, every time we hear directly from her in the text, she speaks God's commands. Instead of relying on human understanding or her own agenda, she pointed people in God's direction. This focus on what God wanted allowed her to be used by God in powerful ways. In Judges chapter 5, we find a poetic recounting of the battle. She praises the tribes of Israel who obeyed God and fought the oppressive Canaanites. However, she ultimately gives God the glory for winning the battle. Another example is that leaders have to stay focused on the big picture and not themselves. Godly leaders have to stay focused on what He wants and give Him the glory. Second, leaders need allies. Part of Israel's struggle was the lack of unity. In Deborah's time, Israel did not act as a nation. It was a loose collection of tribes. Deborah's instructions from the Lord and her song illustrate the importance of allyship. Barak needed to gather soldiers to work together to defeat the enemies who oppressed them. Deborah understood this and praised the tribes who worked together. She also went with Barak. She scolded him for being hesitant and afraid, but then she stood by him and encouraged him by being present. After the battle, they celebrated by singing together. Jael also teaches us something about where to look for allies. It is important to note that Jael's family were not Israelites. The text actually says Sisera and Yabin were at peace with her people, the Kenites. It also says the Canaanites were known to be cruel to their enemies. Jael was not an obvious ally of Israel, but she clearly chose the side of the Israelites. The text does not clearly explain why she did this, but it does say that through her actions, God subdued the Canaanites, and she is lauded in the poetic account of the battle as the most blessed of women. Allies may not look like us. They may not share a common background or obvious loyalties. In this case, Jael shared one key characteristic with the Israelites. She allowed herself to be an instrument in the hand of the Lord against his enemies. God used her act of resistance against the Canaanites to carry out his justice. Godly leaders should remember this. Allies will not always look a certain way or be instantly recognizable. You will find them when you look for those who seek justice and oppose God's enemies. Finally, leaders need courage. In Judges chapter 4, Deborah's leadership is contrasted with that of Barak. He was understandably scared. Sisera's army had 900 chariots, and Barak probably had none. In the ancient world, this was the equivalent of fighting 900 tanks with only foot soldiers. Barak hesitated to obey unless Deborah went with him. His fear created a vacuum of leadership. On the other hand, Deborah did not hesitate to go with him, even though it would be dangerous. She provided an example of fearless leadership and was honored. Later, what Jael did was definitely courageous. She was clever, but choosing to kill a warrior in his sleep takes nerves of steel. She did not panic, and she made a choice, and she called the dangerous Sisera inside. She was intentional and clear-headed. When Sisera asked for water, she gave him milk so that he would sleep. And while he slept, she acted decisively to destroy the enemy of God. Given the cruelty of the Canaanites, this decision took great courage. Ultimately, this story should encourage anyone who questions what it takes to be a leader. It may not be what you think. You might be surprised when you find a godly leader. You might be even more surprised to find that person is you. Deborah and Jael remind us that being a friend of God is the most important quality. With God on your side, you can focus on him. You can be courageous. And you know your strongest allies are his other friends. In the words of Deborah, "So may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but your friends be like the sun as he rises in his might."